This week we're talking about classical and contemporary poetry. So it's a little bit of a revisitation of the concept of high art. We'll remind ourselves of what that means, and then we'll get a chance to decide how much it matters. I know that a lot of our course is developing good arguments for issues related to literature, culture, and theory. So at the end of the slideshow, you will have the chance to think about how important is it to retain that category of canonical poetry? So we'll get there. That's the question we'll talk about at the end of this slideshow. We saw most of this slide on another occasion. It's from the Fisher article, the ideas in this slide, and the Fisher article is there in the e-text for us to look at again as we finalize our thoughts on what high art means. The parts of the definition I took from Fisher are that high art is morally serious in its content, it's emotionally genuine, and it also has attributes that are original, that push art forms forward. It demonstrates skill and knowledge of the form, knowledge of tradition, and engagement with broader ideas that relate to the time it's being produced in or issues that are ongoing from another time in artistic history. I decided to use an illustration by Romer Bearden for the illustration in this slide. That's a African-American artist that used collage a lot in the 20th century. So this is a painting that you will see, or an artwork that you'll see in the Cincinnati Art Museum. What do you think about these attributes? Are these attributes that we ought to broadly expect art to accomplish if we're going to invest our time in it? Shouldn't it be morally serious and genuine, not shallow, not conventional, not sentimental? So give yourself a minute or two or so just to think about, do these attributes seem desirable to you? The idea of high art is very central to the similar construct of a literary canon. And the Wilczek article that is also available in the e-text, that article tells us that the canon, for some, expresses cultural authority by people influential in the past. And we had the discussion last week about Shakespeare, that a lot of cultural authority in William Shakespeare, influential in the past. But at the same time, it is no longer required that English education students take Shakespeare. Maybe you could say that even Shakespeare at this point is a space of cultural conflict, that there's debatable ground about the importance of that writer for every person. And different institutions and people, maybe groups, might disagree on what has authority, what's influential, what things are essential across the board if you are to become a literate reader. One more line is here from Wilczek, that debates about the canon are met with suspicion, a hermeneutics of suspicion. So whenever we discuss the canon, according to Wilczek, people express some skepticism about the worthiness of the canon. And now that we've had a number of weeks in the course, it's your turn to take a position, a hypothesis in this discussion. According to Wilczek, you can either make a new canon or we get rid of it, or at least call the idea of a canon into question. Somehow in our field, the idea of a canon still seems to be a handy one to have around, but do we really think so? Is it preventing us from seeing the contemporary world, valuing contemporary poets? Because we do invest so much time in the history of writers within our discipline. What should we do? With our exercise, we're going to think about the choices of create a new canon or move on from the concept altogether. And we'll do a short case study of these questions in the rest of this slideshow. And as you move on to your work for the weekly discussion, you'll be looking at two poems, Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, very well-known poem assigned quite widely in introductions to poetry. And then our colleague, Dorothy Chan, Triple Sonnet for My Aggressive Forehead. I want for us to think about these ideas of canonical and post-canonical poetry. Do we need to disinvest in the concept of a poetry canon? And does it help us to understand that question if we look at these two poems, what they offer as subject matter, what kind of interpretations of the world do they offer? Does this give us any ground to see whether or not having a poetry canon is useful? As we think about this question of canonical versus non-canonical poetry, I want for us to do a little bit of careful reading and discovery. That means reading the poem with care, hearing the poem with care, and then moving from there to critical responses. I've summarized 3 areas of emphasis that you can use for a critical response here in the rest of this slide. It's good to look at what is said in the poem, the subject matter. It's good to look at how is the meaning presented? How is it said? The techniques used for language and word choice and other aspects of the poem. And third, is the message worth saying? And is it well said? Sometimes that's the first thing we do when we encounter a new piece of art. Evaluate its worthiness, make a judgment. Sometimes that's fun to do. So I'm inviting you to do these 3 steps as you look at 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird and Triple Sonnet to My Aggressive Forehead. Let's use these 3 lenses to help us analyze and make an evaluation of the poems in relationship to a literary canon that makes some poems available to everyone, but other poems are not a part of that literary canon. I'll mention also that the ideas in this slideshow came from a resource you have in your 284 Canvas page, Literary Analysis of Prose and Poetry, Basic Techniques. So that can be used at any time that you might need a guide to do critical responses to prose or poetry. Let's now go ahead with our reading of 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, one of the 2 poems that we are reading for today in this slideshow and in the discussion. And this is a widely circulated, widely anthologized 20th century American poem. We're going to start out with a close reading type encounter with this poem. I guess I already told you a little bit about the poem, but let's focus on the words and versification for a few minutes. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know, too, that the blackbird is involved in what I know? 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him, in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. What do you think so far? Let's transition to putting our critical hat on, and we'll think about ways that we can critique and make deeper sense out of this poem. And I'm borrowing a little bit from W.R. Keast, who's a critic from several decades ago. And it's kind of fun to take a look at criticism when the poem was released. This critic actually said he is not able to understand a lot of Wallace Stevens's poetry, which is true of a lot of Wallace Stevens, that obliqueness or inscrutability is part of the style of Wallace Stevens, that it's hard to find the meaning. I remember we used to talk about Wallace Stevens as an imagist, of where he wants to provide words that are directly visual or sensory in some way, and to not have a lot of abstract ways of expressing meaning so that those images are so distinctive. Like at the end of that poem where the blackbird sat in cedar limbs. Many people that wrote in this imagist style felt that you didn't need to say anything else, that having that blackbird sitting in the cedar limbs is all you want the reader to see. W.R. Keast has a few other ideas to add to the mix here. He's really interested in whether you read this poem as 13 different poems or one poem that is kind of a suite with close connections. So what do you think about the variety of imagery in the poem and whether or not each stanza and idea connects with the whole? That for Keast is a good first starting point. How much unity does the poem have? Keast goes further in this slide just to say that the second view that there is this poem is one way of looking at a blackbird, and you need all 13 kinds of images to make it work. And that's one reason why I picked the Romare Bearden illustration for the beginning of this slideshow talk today, is because Romare Bearden uses collage, and each individual element works together to create the whole. Is that the sense you got from 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird? And we're looking here at Keith's language. If it is a collection of 13 separate poems, we don't expect to find any reason why it has 13 parts. We don't expect to find any loss if we took parts 6 and 7 out. I've always assumed that this poem has a unity, but is that an assumption based on any attribute of the poem? If it has unity, what is that unity? So these are questions that we can think about whether we are writing poems or reading them. If you do have a triple sonnet, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, is there a kind of essential unity between each element? This is a final thought from Keast. What secondary conclusions do we come to if we think of this poem as 13 representations of a single state of mind? What does it say about the sequence of images if we think it's different representation? What about the speaker? We've talked some about the speaker. Where is this voice coming from in the poem, this disembodied voice? Where is it and what is its purpose? So these are the kinds of questions we can think about depending on whether we think this poem is 13 separate poems or one poem with 13 dimensions, so to speak. At this point, I am going to invite you also to take a look at Dorothy Chan's poem, Triple Sonnet for My Aggressive Forehead. She's a colleague of mine here in the English department. You may well have had her if you are taking a course in poetry, and you may have her in the future if you decide that creative writing and poetry is your focus. So I'd like for you to read this poem as well and to think about these two poems in relationship to the poetry canon and what we could call the post-canon history of poetics as a genre. I'd like for you to integrate your thoughts into this week's discussion group exercise. And as usual, 125 words for your first post. If you can, engage with others. I'm not requiring this or grading on this, but if you do have a chance to take a look at what others are thinking, that can be informative and interesting to talk about. So as you do this, please respond to the evaluation questions in the discussion board, which include, let's briefly summarize for these poems. What is said, how is it said, and is it worth saying? So this will be a brief response to those questions. Maybe it is 50 or 75 words. And then the second part of your discussion, looking at these two poems, is it clear whether we need a literary canon to collect up the best poems and represent the genre of poetry? Is there something that is gained by having that device around or not? So let's discuss these things on the discussion board. We'll see what we come up with after the week. And I hope you have a good week of class. We'll come back and talk about these subjects when we get together next Monday, April 4th. Have a good week, and I will see you soon.